Recent signs of relative calm in the eurozone have been credited to the European Central Bank and its willingness to go into the markets in some circumstances to buy up government debt. So what's the view from inside the ECB? Is the crisis over?
We have seen an improvement, especially when you compare to the situation in the first half of last year, where you were not only concerning the eurozone, but in general, you had a lot of scenarios, catastrophic scenarios running around, and I think the risks were really there. These fears, I call it fears, have receded significantly later in the year. You see that with the fear of hard landing in China, the US fiscal cliff, and of course not least, the eurozone breakup scenarios that were running around. Now you have to see, of course, why is that so? And that's the next question. And very often when you read the comments, analysts, journalists, you see very often one gives a lot of credit, especially in the eurozone, to the central bank for that.
Which you're happy to accept?
Well, to some extent, I would say. One has to be careful about these arguments because you don't want to raise expectations too much that central banks are the solution to many of the structural problems of our society. The central banks can help in providing liquidity to avoid, let's say, brutal deleveraging processes or self-reinforcing negative dynamics that you can have. But you have to admit usually that they don't solve the structural problems of our societies.
Are you concerned that because the pressure in financial markets is off, they might ease back on reform efforts that aren't politically very easy to do?
No, the way is still long, and that's why usually one of the messages that we as central bankers give is that you have to persevere in the structural reforms because they start to be recognized. There are a number of countries, even those that were extremely hit by the crisis, like a country like Ireland, but even I would say Greece. You see Spain now. You see a lot of concrete results which are there. But you're right. I mean, one has to be, and that's one of the things we look at, aware that when conditions improve, the temptation, of authorities, because it's difficult to do, but the temptation of authorities to just delay again is there. We call it moral hazard, as you know, and so one has to be aware of that. That's correct.
And what about the question of fiscal austerity, governments trying to get their borrowing needs down, as many are doing, not just the ones in the most immediate difficulty? Isn't that a counterproductive thing to do at a time when the economy is so weak?
Usually you start with structural adjustment, you would recognize the deflationary effects or the recessionary effect in the short term, and you would smooth. That would be an ideal textbook case. Now what we see...
Politicians can't follow the textbook.
See exactly the opposite. We see structural adjustment is a bit further away. They cut in infrastructure, which is not the best thing to do. And they would probably raise some taxes which will have some distortionary effects on the supply side of the economy and things like that. And then you say, well, austerity kills the economy. I think if you do structural reform, there are more rooms to smoothen the adjustment. But the problem is that the reality usually is not that way.
Now in Italy, very important eurozone economy, there's an election coming up. I won't ask you to tell me who you want to win it, but clearly whoever does is going to have a big challenge on their hands, aren't they?
Italy has been in a very weak structural position since years and years. And I think this is being addressed by the present government. Some fundamental issues, for example, on the labor market, in corporate governance, are being addressed, I think, in a very impressive way by authorities. The question is always who bears the burden. And so these internal distributional discussions, of course, are the key, of course, and each country has to address them, of course. That's the skill of politics, of course, and that's not my business.
Now, the first decade of the euro, we had some big bubbles in credit. In governments, some governments were able to borrow very cheaply. We had big booms in housing and construction in Spain and Ireland, for example. How confident are you that the eurozone can avoid a repeat of that kind of terrible experience?
There are 2 points in your question. The first point is we have seen these indebtedness, or too much debt, too much leverage everywhere in most mature economies. So it's not only eurozone. And what is the role of monetary policy in addressing these issues? And monetary policy has its limit, of course. And so there are a lot of discussions about how can monetary policy contribute to avoid, let's say, financial cycles in general.
Should you have had higher interest rates in the last decade?
Well, actually, we did actually, you know,
higher than you even did.
Well,
though.
no, but when you know, we have two-pillar strategy, and this has not been considered in the boom period as something very useful. And I was not there in that business at that time, but I think it's. I think we should have done even more from our two-pillar strategy. The second pillar strategy is looking at money supply.
Yeah.
And credit. The counterpart of money is credit. And there it is clear when you look backwards in these years, you saw, of course, that money supply was increasing very fast at one point, and even faster in the country you mentioned, like Spain, for example. And the standard monetary policy reacted at a time when inflation was very low, and that was criticized at that time. But so there was some reaction of this institution, thanks to this second pillar. But it was obviously not enough, and so we have to think why. And the answer today is, first, we look at these issues now, but we also say that you need another instrument, which is not necessarily a central banking instrument, has to do with macroprudential regulation, macroprudential instruments. It's to look at the behavior of the supply side, the banking behavior on credit, and also the demand for loans. And so you have to enrich the toolbox. It's not only interest rate that can, of course, bring the solution.